So that's good. So we've got the first one I've just described. Medicine has been strictly controlled, very precise numbers. Universities are not allowed to go beyond those. The current government has like these ad hoc places, like the nuclear submarine places. For Indigenous students in bachelor degrees, we've got demand-driven funding, so that is unlimited numbers of students in this group. And except in medicine, there are no current enrolment caps. So once you exhaust it, once you use all your maximum basic grant amount, you can enroll on a student contribution basis only. If you do it, it's called over-enrollment, and historically over-enrollment has been an important feature of our system. According to the minister, this is what he calls a Hunger Games system. Referring back to the previous conversation, when I asked Copilot for this, I put it to made-up universities into competition in Australia, but these are all real ones now. And so what he wants is less competition and more system. So basically trying to crack down on the universities that are over-enrolling in order to create more stability and more certainty for the universities that are currently under-enrolling. There are no official recent stats on under or over-enrollment. What I've done here is use a rough proxy, which is the expected student contribution revenue. The yellow is about 12% of indexation over this period. Roughly speaking, I suspect any uni below that 12% is under-enrolled, and some of the ones up the top are probably significantly over-enrolled. And so essentially under the Jason Clare ATEC view of things, there's going to be a much flatter line in that growth if things work out as he hopes. What I think we're headed to, this is going back to Australian political traditions. Part of this, what I've just talked about, which is limiting over-enrolments, is what I call the protectionist. Alfred Deakin, early Prime Minister, who was the leader of the protectionist party. Then the free trade rival, George Reid there, another early Prime Minister. I think there are big tensions between these two approaches. On the other hand, they did basically merge to create the modern Liberal Party, so you can deal with tension sometimes. So how is this going to work in the future? I think there will probably be a cabinet level decision on the total number of student places in the system. And the fact that it'll be about places rather than dollars, though I'm sure they'll do a rough calculation of those, will be very important. So moving to places creates a much tighter relationship with the likely number of headcount students than our current dollar-based system, which in theory, given the different Commonwealth contributions that go to make up the MBGA, would correspond to a wide range of potential student numbers. So if you want to increase participation, it's important to have some rough idea of how many students you might get from the system. The minister will then issue what they call a statement of expectations to this new Australian Tertiary Education Commission, to set up broad things like number of students, probably a whole lot of performance targets that universities will have to meet, including around equity enrolments. And then ATEC will try and implement this via these mission-based compacts. Now, we already have things called compacts. I don't think it'll be like those. This is more like the funding agreements that we have now, for those who know those. We'll get to a system of so-called managed growth. This appears quite frequently in the government. We've got managed growth for international students as well. There'll be this FSL allocation, full-time equivalent student allocation to each institution. If you go over that number, originally they wanted a hard cap, so 0 student contributions if you go over. Now they're talking about a 2 to 5% leeway above that, where you'll get the student contribution, but not the Commonwealth contribution. And beyond that, 0 funding. And so this is a much harder cap than we have now. And presumably unis will be putting much more focus on load management, not to go over that 5% where they're taking students with no revenue. Under enrolment, that is taking less than the required number of FSL, there will be a funding floor for at least the next 5 or 6 years, which will be 97.5% of your previous year's funding. Again, reflecting this idea of system stability, but that would still be a significant blow to some institutions. One of the problems from my point of view is that this system, even though ATEC will hopefully do more than the current department in thinking about where numbers are actually likely to go, you will get lots of difficulties in managing how demand moves, sometimes at fairly short notice. So this is just an example of the change in applications between 2023 and 2024. Across the system, the numbers were actually in total fairly similar. Looks like stable demand. But if you look at the institution level, you can see that some have had big increases in demand, some have had big decreases. How is this going to work out in this system where there is less capacity to over-enroll if you've got those high increases in demand? With a colleague from University of Australia in Hausu, I've been doing some interview research with university leaders about how they think about their Commonwealth supported places, how many to have, what discipline to put them in, those kinds of issues. Just a couple of quotes there. What's really come out in the interviews with those universities is how they use over-enrollment to achieve their equity missions. Even though Adam was talking about some control this morning, I couldn't help noticing his numbers were going up pretty fast. So this is kind of an example of what we're talking about. We're an equity-focused university. It's got significant demand. Under the system proposed, ATEC will probably make some allowance for that, but ultimately they would not be able to continue with their current practice of basically taking any suitable equity applicant. One of these institutions was a regional university. Basically, they said to us, if a student wants an on-campus education, there's simply no realistic alternative in this area to us. And so if we can't take them, they simply miss out because there's no other options. To me, that's a classic example of how a flexible system can deal with demand that wasn't necessarily fully predictable, but is important to meet. This is where we get to the free trade exceptions. So the Indigenous bachelor degree demand-driven system will continue alongside this more tightly controlled system for other students. The government wants to extend demand-driven funding for Indigenous to medicine. How this will work, I've got no idea because we've got a history of a field with extremely strict controls on numbers linked to the supply of doctors into the workforce, yet there'll be this variable category on the side. How will that work? Got no idea. Then probably the most confusing concept in the whole new system, which is effectively demand-driven funding for variously described underrepresented, disadvantaged, or equity backgrounds. I don't know exactly which of the equity groups will finally be in this. And I'm going to talk about that a bit more in a moment. And then the ones you do actually enroll, there's going to be a separate needs-based loading, which is not limited in the number of dollars you can get for that, just linked to the number of students. So this is kind of how I understand it. I haven't found anyone who can really explain this in a convincing way to me, but essentially ATEC will try and guess to some extent or estimate to some extent where equity students are likely to be applying and try and adjust the cap for the universities to accommodate them as best as possible. Then we'll get this new category of an equity student who is eligible for a place but hasn't in fact received an offer. So whether this is for university got a minimum ATAR or some other kind of minimum entry requirement, this signals eligibility for a Commonwealth supported place, but then some unclear process for how we deal with this. In the documents they put out last year, there's going to be some convoluted process where you try and find a place at another university, perhaps, if they had unused places. Going back to ATEC for additional funding, but how this is going to work, particularly in kind of the fairly fast-moving cycles of offers during that enrolment period, I'm really not sure how practical this is. And in some ways, it's just a convoluted fix to a problem they've created for themselves by the harder caps on total numbers in the first place. This is just an example of how hard it can be to predict. This is the existing Indigenous demand-driven system. What happens is the department asks universities to estimate their funding for the following year. So late 2024, the universities put in their estimates of the value of the Indigenous demand-driven students they were going to have. In May 2025, less than 6 months later, after the March census date, you can see that many of the universities were way off. Either have far fewer than they expected or far more than they expected. It's just, to me, a really compelling example of, even if you've actually done significant work to estimate what the numbers are, the reality could end up being significantly different. And we're hampering our capacity to respond quickly to issues that are emerging. Similarly, low SES numbers, that's over a longer time periods comparing 2 years. You can see that they're slightly down, the yellow, across the system, but very substantially down in some institutions and up in others. So is this going to create some really complex system of trading? And, if the alternative course is not on the student's preference list, maybe that's for very good reasons, don't want to go to that university. I just don't know how this is going to work. And going back to the Hunger Games theme, if there's any place where there's Hunger Games, it's equity students. There's a fairly finite number of them, and so there's a lot of fighting over them. And essentially, the group of 8 universities are using their wealth to buy students by offering scholarships, which may not be a bad thing, but it does make the whole system more predictable and more unstable for the universities that cannot afford to match these generous scholarships. The next question that I'm worried about here is what they're going to do in skills planning. The history here is that they've tried to allocate to particular courses in the past during the first term of the Albanese government. It would seem to flow from that they might do this on a much grander scale under this new system. This is not actually what they're saying in the transition documents to the universities at this stage, but I'm just not sure how if they're going to cripple market mechanisms, how you're actually going to get this more efficient matching of the places offered to what ATEC or Jobs and Skills Australia thinks are the areas of skills needs. My own view of this is that all these systems are demand constrained. That is, you can't force students to do things they don't want to do. But you can, as we have done historically in medicine, you can limit oversupply by simply limiting the number of places. And so I'm concerned that that kind of medicine practice might spread into other fields where they deem that too many arts graduates or too many education graduates or whatever it is, that this will become a feature of the system designed to bring down excess numbers in the labour market. For me, then, is that the system is always demand constrained. Every condition you add to a place, whether that's the university, the type of course, the type of student, equity student, every one of those conditions reduces the chance that you can actually find a student who ticks all those boxes. And I guess for a government that actually wants to increase participation in uni, my concern would be that the theoretical capacity of the system will be well in excess of the number of students we actually enrol, for the reason that we don't have a flexible enough system to basically follow them where they want to go. Similarly, at the moment, we've sort of got this relaxation of international student policy, no official penalty for going over the target number, but it looks like ATEC will take over this function from 2027, and I suspect we might see something similar to what we're going to see for domestic students for internationals as well. So this area of significant flexibility of the universities will also go into ATEC's control. So overall, a much more regulated system than we have today. Because we're running short on time, I think I was going to axe my stuff on extra regulation and go straight to questions. Or
what is your choice? More of Andrew or questions from the floor?
Do you want to see what the regulations are?
Go.
Go. All right, I'll try and cut some luck. The earlier slide said, I think there's a major loss of confidence in the sector from the government, probably a bit of vice versa as well, but they've got the power and the money. My concern here is not that there are no problems to be fixed. There are, and this goes to what Ian Martin was talking about this morning as well. My concern here is that we're seeing what I call a piling on of both regulations and regulators on the same or heavily overlapping matters. And whether this is an efficient form of regulation, whether it's going to have negatives. Also seeing a change in the style of regulation. If you go back to, say, when TEXA was founded about 15 years ago, things are expressed in terms of principles. Now they're being expressed in terms of the detailed things you must do. So quite a different qualitative approach to higher education. That's their audit instead of a risk approach. So one area where this has happened is in the process of admitting and supporting students. Until the 2020, effectively, this was largely administered by TEXA. Since then, we've had a whole lot of new rules. So there are Department of Education is deeply involved in this. Now have to decide on admission to a subject as well as to a course. And then you've got these different ways of managing student risk. So the genuine student policy basically requires universities to check that a student is engaged prior to the census date, with a strong implication to cancel enrolment if they're not. But then from last year, we've got this support for students policy, which to me pushes them in the opposite direction. That if they're struggling, you should do everything you can to support them rather than cancel the enrolment. And because these regulations seem to have been developed in isolation from each other, I'm not sure how these work in practice, but it seems like the regulations aren't particularly coherent. There have been all these different isolated reasons why they've gone for them and not developed a more coherent approach. Then we've got the issue of sexual harassment and other kinds of misconduct. Here, we've got this interaction of general principles around safety and complaints, which have existed for a long time, and then being layered on with new regulations this year with the National Student Ombudsman to deal with complaints about this, and from next year, the incredibly detailed code on gender-based violence. Now, possibly something like this was necessary to deal with university failings in this area, but it is a classic example of the radical change in philosophy here. It's not risk-based. There's essentially 4 pages in the codes on all the things the university will have to do in reporting to the government. And importantly, all of this being administered by bureaucrats, essentially under the direct control of the minister, rather than an arm's length body like TEXA. So just in conclusion, the question is, there are always trade-offs. It's kind of talked about this morning with other speakers as well. But are these the right trade-offs? So I think ATEC probably will improve system stability just because the more successful players will be held back. But in my view, more student places won't be used at all, and fewer students will get their first preference course. So they may be less likely to accept their offer, less likely to stay if they do enrol in something which wasn't their first preference. What we're also going to see, I think, cumulatively, is a very substantial diversion of university resources away from core university activities in teaching and research and towards compliance. Like some of these are massively complex regulations. The gender-based violence thing, probably spent more than a week just reading through it all and trying to write up what I thought the implications were. This is going to be hugely onerous. And to me, it's just not clear that the regulators do understand the trade-offs, even can understand the trade-offs. They don't work in universities. And as a result, even though some problems will be solved, the system as a whole may be worse off. Thank you.
So in essence, TEXA is going to come around and kick your door in and ask for evidence of a bunch of stuff. Then ATEC's going to come around and count all your students to make sure they're in the right groups.
Then
We've got time for a couple of questions. Anybody? Anyone on that?
right.
Thanks, Andrew. That was great. I don't know how you managed to make something so complex and bewildering actually understandable. Adding another layer of complexity, this shift towards harmonisation and sort of Barney Glover's work on, pushing more towards skills and so on.
Yeah.
That adds a whole other level of complexity, doesn't it, in terms of demand and caps and so on. How does that fit into it all?
Partly, I think unis will get around it by trying to you go study at TAFE, use their EFSL equivalent, and then come here, because that can be a more efficient way of using it. But I guess harmonisation to me is another area where there could be huge effort to standardise things when in fact the number of people who want to do that pathway isn't terribly large. Like there are a few obvious areas like enrolled versus registered nurses where there are, obviously reasonable number of transitions, and that's worth doing. But I guess I've not seen compelling evidence that this is worth doing on a massive scale. Two sectors have different purposes. They're not going to be perfectly compatible, and we shouldn't try and do so.
Andrew, we're having a very vigorous debate internally at the moment about EFSL per head per year. We have a very, very low, about 0.55.
Yeah.
Where do you see that falling into the new model, and is that going to be taken into account?
Great. Yeah, that's actually, I hadn't even thought of that. So if the department is trying to hit a participation target, they need to have some model of the head count. And so possibly that will affect the way you get EFSL, because that will affect the number of headcount you'll get. But also, the universities have a lot of part-time students who will vary their numbers. I think the process of hitting a precise target is more difficult for those institutions than those who have fairly predictable full-time enrolments. And one of the things we've seen in recent years is a slight tendency to more part-time study, particularly for the continuing students, which I think has caused a lot of unpredictability for many universities.
Anybody else?
Hi, Andrew. Given that after from
Yeah,
the university, given that the government actually want to have less competition, do you see a scenario where there will be a lot of merging in the universities?
I hope not. I know we just had one in South Australia, but there's probably even less plausible ones probably happening in Western Australia in the next few years. I guess my concern is that mergers suck all the energy out for both organisations for years while they bed them down. Cannot possibly be worth it. And I think my answer to that is no. But if you do have this system approach, you can see why they might want to do it.
Well, I've got one.
Thanks. G'day, James Martin from Insider. I'm just curious about the upcoming ministerial directive for international students, maybe dropping in October. Do you have any insight into how that might take shape, considering the number of international students and the caps has sort of become a bit messy?
Yeah, so I think it'll be fairly similar to one-on-one, but presumably some way of getting in the new criteria, such as student accommodation and Southeast Asia engagement. I guess my own view is these ministerial determinations have probably been overrated. Like it now turns out they're not being enforced. And that, I think, will definitely affect behaviour this year and next year. To me, probably the bigger issues have been the changes to migration rules, which for some reason haven't had as much attention. But you can really see that the historically sensitive to migration countries, South Asian countries in particular, have been much more affected by these changes than have, say, the Chinese market, who are less sensitive. Fewer of them want to come and stay in Australia permanently. On average, come from wealthier families, so the visa fees aren't such an issue. So to me, they are probably the big long-term drivers on the demand side. And then the supply side things may be less important if you simply can't get enough demand to use your cap anyway.
Andrew, QUT is getting a med school, and it's getting a med school by carving out other CSP places to pay for it. Given this sort of re-regulation, can we get to the stage in the future, hypothetically, where the engineers lobby says we need lots more engineers, so the department offers engineering and specialist engineering courses and whatever, if they can fund it internally?
There is one area here where I think ATEC could do some positive things, and this is kind of talking about something that Adam was talking about this morning. That while I'm quite happy for competition in all the major degrees, there are a few niche areas where are already being closed and will continue to be closed simply because the institutions cannot get to a viable number of students. In those cases, I think it would be sensible for ATEC to take a national or state level view of this and say, well, we know there's only limited demand for this course, but it is important for reasons X, Y, and Z. And therefore, we will sustain it at one institution, even if the numbers aren't big enough to normally justify it. That's sort of how the system was supposed to work before, that it was kind of a block grant. You made profits on some courses, losses on others. It basically secured your mission. But the funding system has basically now moved to average teaching and scholarship costs, which essentially removes the fat in the system that might have been used to sustain courses that weren't self-financing. I think that's one of the reasons why we're seeing all these course closures around the country. In my view, it's not because the vice chancellor's a bastard or anything like that. This is simply the logic of the funding system. It's following, what the dollars essentially require you to do, and without sending your institution broke.
Thanks for this, Andrew. I'm just wondering if the government's kind of done any modeling on the societal change that these things are going to create potentially. And I talk about the mad rush for ATAR, because essentially every university has fewer places to offer. ATARs will go up. The high achieving students, they'll be fine. They'll find a place. The equity groups, they'll be fine. Universities can tweak equity schemes to make sure that they get their numbers. Every university in their catchment will have a middle band that don't have an ATAR high enough to get in, and are not in an equity group to get in otherwise. So effectively, you have a middle band of students and families missing out, and then trying to find either to get into an equity group or a selective school or another school to kind of boost their ATAR, which then puts other pressures in the city.
So I guess an important variable here is how high will the caps be? So if you add, 25% to every university, there may be theoretical caps, but it's de facto it's a demand-driven system, just because they won't reach their caps anyway. I guess the concern is less that they'll probably happen at a system level, but it will happen at local levels where the allocation to a particular university is well below its demand and the demand that we'll be happy to meet in a more flexible system, which might cause these behaviours. On the other hand, people could say ATAR is not the only thing. You can start in one course, move to another. There are all sorts of other alternative entry methods. And for some courses, we will still have, I think, a lot of ATAR competition, but in most of them, there will be a wide range of flexible options for getting into the course.
Thank you. Matt Carter, Monash. Thank you, Andrew. I wonder, as we move from a dollar-based system to a headcount-based system, what kinds of conversations are likely to happen in load planning as universities respond to that and try and maximise? So if, for instance, you might be thinking about maximising margin per head, you might preference your lower cost of delivery courses. If you're thinking about maximising revenue per head, you might preference your higher fee courses. These kinds of economic calculus are going to be brought into load planning decisions, which of course they are at the moment, but in a much more acute way and in quite different ways depending on the circumstances of universities. I wonder if you have a view on how that might play out and how those perverse incentives might play out.
So at the moment, one of the aspects of the system is like you get, $30,000 for a medicine FSOL, but $1,200 or $1,300 for a law or business or arts. What we found in the research I was doing was that even though we call this the maximum basic grant amount, the universities interpret this as the minimum basic grant amount, and that not achieving that is seen as failure. It's viewed negatively by the government, and it's viewed negatively by their colleagues who basically think you're at the moment being paid for students you're not actually delivering, while we are only being partially funded for the students we are delivering. So at the moment, there is a very strong attempt to do what it takes to meet the maximum basic grant amount. This is also driven behaviour such as moving postgrad fee paying to postgraduate CSP in order to meet that number. That will, as you say, this will actually shift that dynamic and be less about maximising the Commonwealth contribution as instead it'll be about hitting this precise number, which can be really hard to do, which is why the government decided to go for a slight margin. One of my concerns here would be that because you've got this effective hard cap at 2 or 5%, whatever it ends up being, but only modest penalties for under-enrolling, a cautious university might be a bit conservative in their offers because over-enrollment might be worse than under-enrolment. And therefore, again, the kind of logic of the system ends up with fewer students than it could in theory support.
Anybody else? I think it's time to go to lunch. Andrew Norton, thank you very much.